Good morning. Today we're going to speak about Fyodor Dostoevsky, born in 1821 and died in 1881. From a very early age, he was exposed to a wide range of literature, beginning with fairy tales and Russian legends, and then also the Bible was a strong influence behind his literary formation, and novels and poetry, both from Russian authors and from foreign authors. I am not quite sure what foreign authors we are referring to, but definitely he was exposed to a wide range of literature. And when he was 15, already having some literary formation and what he had gained during his early childhood and his first teenage years, he joined the military engineering school. The military engineering school. This happened practically immediately after the passing of his mother. He would graduate from this school, the military engineering school, in 1841. But a few years before he graduated, in 1839, when he was 18, his father died or was murdered, meaning he died in uncertain circumstances. Some claim that he might have been murdered by the peasants that worked for him in a riot, but that's uncertain, and Dostoevsky himself didn't know, and probably he didn't want to delve much into it. And as I said, in 1843, he graduated from the engineering school, and he started to work as an engineer. He was quite successful, not extremely wealthy, but he had financial means. And in addition, to make some extra money, he started working as a translator in his extra time. It was in 1846 when he published his first novel, Poor Folk. That was his first novel, and that granted him entrance into the most renowned literary circles in Russia at the time. With this first literary success, he resigned his military career and he dedicated himself full-time to writing. Becoming familiarized with literary circles, he also became familiarized with literature, but not always literature that was approved by the institutions of Russia under the Tsar, meaning socialist literature. Socialist literature like that of especially French socialists like Fourier, Cabet, Proudhon, Saint-Simon. I'm sure you might have heard of them because Marx labeled all the socialists who preceded him as utopic socialists. So he was reading about socialism, especially in the Petrachevsky circle. Bakunin, by the way, who was not a socialist, he was an anarchist and a revolutionary, looked down upon this circle because he thought this circle, the Petrachevsky circle, was too benevolent, too meek, and they had no revolutionary goals, and they didn't consider revolutionary means. But nevertheless, this was a clandestine activity. This was banned in Russia during the time of the Tsars, and this led to Dostoevsky's arrest in 1849. He was arrested under the charge of reading and discussing forbidden books, and he was condemned to death. From the outset, they knew it was going to be a mock execution, but and I think that the process took like almost a year. So that year, that led to his mock execution, which he didn't know it would be a mock execution. He thought that would be the end of his life. It was very tough, but in the end, to praise the benevolence of the Tsar, his sentence was commuted, and he was sentenced to 10 years of forced labor, 4 of which he served in a Siberian labor camp, and 6 of which he served in the foreign military service, but always forced labor. During about this time, especially in Siberia, he recounts in a later novel which is The House of the Dead. The House of the Dead, which he published in 1861. Of course, his experience in Siberia served as the inspiration for this novel. And in summer, intolerable closeness. In winter, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten, filth on the floors, an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. If you don't know what a herring is, think of a sardine. That's how they were packed. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. There was no room to turn around. From dusk to dawn, it was impossible not to behave like pigs. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. During this time, he was, of course, banned from all reading except for the New Testament. So you can also think about this conversion and interior process he went through during these 10 years. And let me now bring a personal speculation note, and I don't think it's so ingenious, I don't think it's so creative. I'm sure someone has already written about it, but I think Dostoevsky did die after that. And what we have after that is a different Dostoevsky. Why do I say that? Because you compare the early literary works of Dostoevsky with whatever happened after his 10-year service, and you see that there's a very marked difference. It's not like I've read much of his literature before his exile, and I am only familiar with White Nights. White Nights is a romantic novel, so it completely follows the standards of the romantic novel. I was gonna say his characters are very dumb, which makes it very realistic at the same time. And as you read it, you say, no, don't do it. Oh no, he did it. He must not listen to her, And you continue, oh, yeah, he did listen to her. So characters do what they shouldn't do. But of course, I am looking at this novel from an outsider's perspective, and his characters are teenagers or in their early 20s. Maybe if someone read this novel in his early 20s, he would say, how could they do otherwise? So, of course, it speaks. I'm not saying it's not a great novel. Of course, White Nights is a great novel. It's a great novel, but it's very different from the deep psychological penetration that we would find in later writings of Dostoevsky. In 1854, he was released from his forced labors, and he was released, but there were many restrictions on him. Maybe the most important restrictions were first that he was not allowed to get married, and he was not allowed to write. Nevertheless, he was allowed to read, and he started reading Hegel, Kant, St. Augustine, Pushkin, the Russian poet, Plato, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Dickens, Balzac, the French realist, Victor Hugo, of whom we spoke a few days ago, Edgar Allan Poe, and so on. In 1856, he wrote a public letter apologizing for having belonged to the Petrachevsky circle, and thanks to this public apology, which he issued in a letter, the Tsar allowed him to publish and to get married. So the restrictions were lifted, and in 1857 he married Maria Dmitrievna. That was an unhappy marriage, of which he says, because of her strange, suspicious, and fantastic character, we were definitely not happy together, but we could not stop loving each other. And the more unhappy we were, the more attached to each other we became. She would die soon after this, and I don't think it's far-fetched to present the father of the Karamazov brothers rejoicing and at the same time weeping for the death of his wife, templated after this personal experience he had. In 1862, he traveled to Belgium, to Paris, to London, to Switzerland, to Italy, and during this journey he wrote his memoirs, which he published as a writer's notes on summer impressions. 1864, as I mentioned, Maria Dmitrievna died, leaving him and their only son alone. So Dostoevsky had to provide not only for himself but for their young son. And it was in 1866 when he wrote Crime and Punishment, which I'm sure you've heard of, and the main character, Raskolnikov. What does Raskolnikov mean in Russian? It's the heretic. But for the Russian Orthodox Church, a heretic was the atheist. So the name conveys a profound meaning. That same year, 1866, he published The Gambler. The Gambler. It speaks also very eloquently about his own personal experience, because that was one of Dostoevsky's lifetime addictions. He was addicted to gambling, and just yesterday I was reviewing this novel. It's written as a journal, so it's somehow erratic, and that's understandable because actually he didn't write it. He dictated it to Anna Grigorievna. She worked as Dostoevsky's stenographer, and since he was not writing, there are some digressions, and sometimes he stammers, and sometimes he repeats himself, which is completely natural, but it adds to the psychological intensity and to the introspection of the work, The Gambler. So The Gambler, of course, I don't have to tell you what it is about, and it represents, it depicts, it reflects, it mirrors very well Dostoevsky's own addiction. The next year, 1866, he married his stenographer, who was writing, Anna Grigorievna. They got married, and they moved to Italy for a 4-year honeymoon. It was also during this time when he wrote The Idiot in 1869. So, although they were on a trip that didn't prevent Dostoevsky from writing, 4 years later they returned in 1871, and they returned to St. Petersburg having no financial means whatsoever. They endured economic hardships, which moved Dostoevsky to start his own bookstore. He started his own bookstore, and that proved to be successful. Eventually, he didn't need to pay the fee to the bookstore, so The Demons, which sold 3,000 copies from the first printing in 1873, was very successful and brought in a significant financial gain. Not only was Dostoevsky coming back to literary fame, but he was also renowned in intellectual circles, and he became an honorary member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And the Tsar himself, Alexander II, had him for a visit in 1876. He had him on a visit, and he wanted Dostoevsky himself to explain his diary to him. As a result of these visits, Tsar Alexander II had Dostoevsky tutoring his two young sons. In 1881, he produced the brothers Karamazov. Aloysia, the novice. What was Dostoevsky's son's name? Aloysia. So this character is created after the image of his own son, and his son had recently died. So in it you can see the aspirations, the longings he had for his son. And of course it's a very profound novel. It's also very interesting that in Dostoevsky, you can get very well into the emotions and the psychology of the characters without him ever telling you, and he was angry and he was sad and he was distressed. That never happens. Moreover, characters don't usually say, oh, I am distressed, I am sad, I am struggling with remorse. That doesn't usually come in the mouth of the characters, right? But nevertheless, you get a very good sense of what's going on in the lives of his characters. Shortly after he published The Brothers Karamazov, which he intended to be a part of a novel, he wanted to write a sequel. So if you think Brothers Karamazov is long, imagine if he had completed the whole project, but it's an unfinished project. He finished the first part, but he did want to write a sequel in which he would devote more time to Alyosha, because in the first part he dedicates a lot of time to Ivan, and he wanted to write about all of the three brothers. So maybe it was going to be a 3-book series, but he didn't complete it because in 1881 he suffered from pulmonary hemorrhage, which brought him to his death. His last words, a quotation from Matthew chapter 3 verse 4. But John forbade him, saying, I have a need to be baptized of thee, and do comest thou to me? And Jesus answering said unto him, Suffer it to be so for now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill righteousness. To which Dostoevsky added, Here now, permit it, do not restrain me. These were his dying words. Of course, he's incredibly influential in the West. Russians, for the most, don't regard themselves as Westerners. So, even if this is a course of Western literature, we have incorporated both Dostoevsky and Tolstoy because of the impact they've caused in the West. For example, Jean-Paul Sartre was heavily influenced by Dostoevsky. Nietzsche, he said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had something to learn. So he was favorable. To some extent, eventually he said that he was too meek and too close to the character of Jesus. So also Nietzsche rejected Dostoevsky, but nevertheless this rejection speaks about how influential he was, to the point that he deserved the attention of Nietzsche. Hermann Hesse was also very influenced by Dostoevsky. Ernest Hemingway, what did Ernest Hemingway say about him? He said, there are things believable and not to be believed, but some so true that they change you as you read them. Frailty and madness, wickedness and saintliness, and the insanity of gambling were there to be known. James Joyce was heavily influenced by Dostoevsky. Virginia Woolf considered him second only to Shakespeare. Kafka draws his inspiration for The Trial from Crime and Punishment and from the Karamazov brothers. Ultimately, all of the West has been influenced by Dostoevsky. Remember also Jordan Peterson. He has spoken extensively in his podcasts and in his series about the influence of literature, in particular that of Dostoevsky. As a trained psychologist, I find it completely congenial with Jordan Peterson's line of thought. So definitely all of the West has been very influenced by Dostoevsky. In addition, in Dostoevsky we have a forerunner, a precursor of symbolism, of psychoanalysis, of existentialism, and of expressionism. So Dostoevsky was a very fertile and a very fruitful author. Eventually, I will speak also about Tolstoy, and a very interesting point to consider is the differences between the two of them, because both of them can be framed within Russian literature, and they share common traits, sure, but conceding that there are some common traits they share, I think the differences are way more significant. The differences between the two of them, and I will expand on that in the coming lecture, okay? Thank you very much.